Hello everyone! So as you can tell by the title, I will be discussing what I believe is the criteria that makes a good Sonic story. Now I want to say this, I have a passion for storytelling and writing because it's my aspiration, but don't take me as an actual instructor on how these stories should be judged. This is just a way for me to discuss what I believe makes a good Sonic story with the knowledge that I know, and a way for me to express my praises and criticisms on such storylines. I have you guys as my audience and would love to hear what you think. Without further ado, let's begin. Now I have organized my criteria of a Sonic story into 3 categories. Presentation. How does the game present its story in an organic fashion? Does the game utilize other assets like art direction, world building, music, etc. to enhance or support the storyline and themes in the game? Pacing. Does the story or the game itself feel like it's making progress naturally? Is there constant movement in the story? Do the levels in the game have purpose in the story? Are they cohesive in the story? Or do they feel unnecessary filler? Character utilization. Were the characters in the story used to their fullest potential? Are they completely involved in the story, or do they just feel like an afterthought because they had little to no interaction with the plot? Easy to follow, right? So, with the rules being set and clear, let's start with the presentation! How to do it. Anyways, the best games to start off are the classic games in the 90s, specifically Sonic 1, Sonic CD, and Sonic 3. Now, these games don't rely on dialogue or text you will see from an RPG game of that time to tell a story, but they are the definite examples of show, don't tell. The classic games depend on the visuals to tell the story and theme or give subtext to the player of what the game's about. With Sonic 1, it established one of the core themes of the franchise, nature versus technology. Obviously, Sonic and Robotnik represent nature and technology respectively, but you see that message be expressed through the levels. They progressively get more industrial. You go from natural landscapes such as Green Hill and Marble Zone, then to more urban places such as Spring Yard and Starlight, and finally, Scrap Brain Zone, which is full of pollution. The true ending of the game ends with the Chaos Emeralds manifesting more plant life to the island. Even though Sonic 1 is about nature versus technology, Sonic CD takes the same message and adds more nuance to it. The game relies on the time travel gimmick for its storytelling. Quartz Quadrant Zone is a great example as its logical progression from the past to the future. It starts off as a cave filled with crystals in the past, a mining facility is established in the present, and in the good future, there's a whole utopian city based around crystals as the mining has stopped. However, in the bad future, the mining never ceased and there's massive pollution in the caverns due to a Robotnik factory being built. Same amount of storytelling applies to natural landscapes such as Palm Tree Panic and urban areas such as Stardust Speedway. CD is telling us that nature and technology can live in harmony and create desired utopias and lifestyles. It's corrupt people like Robotnik forcing their methods that benefit only them that results in the decay of these places. Sonic 3 is the big one as it is set on Angel Island, a location that's full of ancient wonders. Stage transitions became a standard with this game, which helped make Angel Island feel like a real geographical location in Sonic's world instead of a collection of video game levels. If you look at Angel Island, you will notice that in the Sonic 3 portion of the game, Sonic and Tails are traveling around the circumference of it, while the and Knuckles portion, they're venturing towards the center of the island. More importantly, Sonic 3 has legitimate world building that adds to the history and mythos of Angel Island. Levels such as Hydro City and Marble Garden allude to that ancient civilizations used to live here, and that gets expanded upon once you reach Lava Reef, which transitions into Hidden Palace. This place is kept away from any outsiders because it's sacred, and the mural of Robotnik and Sonic being displayed here, which explains Knuckles' actions throughout the story. Once Sonic returns the Master Emeralds to Angel Island and leaves, while we don't know everything about this island's history, although it did plant the seeds for a follow-up to build upon, as the player, we end the story feeling that it's best to leave the floating island unbothered, as it's sort of taboo for any outsiders that foot on it. Luckily, we gained the respect of the main inhabitant of said island and probably made him to an ally or possible friend. Nice attention to detail is that in Knuckles' story, when it's taking place after Sonic and Tails' story, the backgrounds reflect that. Let's fast forward to Sonic Adventure 2, and I believe its presentation is the best. The world map is one of those reasons. This is the best world map in the entire series, as not only is it easy to navigate, it tells you exactly where the levels are geographically in Sonic's world, making them feel like real locations, especially when you get to outer space with the Space Colony arc. Alongside the fact that the first mission of every level tells you your objective correlates with the narrative of the game, Sonic Adventure 2 makes you feel like you're on, well, an adventure. Another example of how SA2 takes advantage of having great presentation is the music that amplifies what the player will be feeling in the moment. Look at Green Forest. Island's about to blow up, Sonic's frantically running through a forest that's determining around him, and again, the music. You don't get stereotypical jungle music. No, once your feet hit the ground, you get "Run, bitch! Run!" On the first time playthrough, you're full of anxiety and dread like Sonic if you don't make it to the end, or else you get blown up. Canyon's Core is a great final level in terms of visual storytelling where each act progressively goes from what you're used to seeing in art to something that's reminiscent of the Mystic Ruins, which shows off Jared Robotnik's being inspired by his travels to the ancient ruins and Angel Island, but also makes this era of the level and arc itself feel taboo to the player. Sonic and Knuckles, or the player himself, should not be here as only Gerald should have the right to access this place. Also, the last thing I love about the presentation in SA2 is this. As a kid, this made me feel like I was watching a war movie. Anyways, this was a cool thing that SA2 tells you the current time and location that the subsequent cutscene would take place. But it was most likely done that way so after Eggman threatens the world of Eclipse Canyon, the text now adds a timer to when the Eclipse Canyon will fire and how much time the heroes have left to prevent the arc from colliding into the earth, adding a sense of urgency and dread to the player. This is what happens when games take presentation of their stories very seriously. If a game doesn't take advantage of presenting a story well, the plot that the game wants to tell will suffer and be very unfocused. The recent classes on the game, Sonic Superstars, is the biggest example of this. The game takes place on the North Star Islands, which unlike Little Planet or Angel Island, doesn't really feel like an actual geographical location in Sonic's world. North Star Islands, to me, is just a collection of levels for the player to go to. You can look at these levels and go, that's the first level, that's the jungle level, that's the desert level, that's the water level, etc. This issue is very apparent to how the lore behind the Black Dragon is handled. The game does not allude to this dragon existing to the last minute. But what about the cartoon on YouTube? That's not in the game, it's inorganic material. This is what I mean when I say that the Northside Islands are just a collection of levels because none of the zones build up the Black Dragon. Yeah, the Black Onyx is on the world map, but that is such a blink and you miss it moment, and that doesn't mean anything when playing the Speed Jungle Zone. Also, the last level, Egg Fortress, is in space. Why are we in space? Wasn't the whole point of Eggman being on the Northside Islands is to find the Black Dragon? What's he trying to accomplish by having another space station? To me, it's like the game forgot the motivation of the villain. Another reason why Superstar's story doesn't work is its music. Now, music is subjective, but a track should complement whatever stage that it plays over to personify what the level represents in the story. Let's use Sonic 3 for example. If I play... this song could give an impression of something mysterious, forgotten, ancient, foreboding, although inviting. Once I tell you that this plays over a level that features a sacred altar hidden deep inside a flying island, you can see the connection. With Superstars, if I play this, you would think this song plays over a level that is supposed to be happy, like the first level of the game, or a cloud level, right? This plays over an ancient city in ruins filled with lava. See the disconnect? Golden Capital is supposed to be this grand level a la Hidden Palace in Sonic 3, but you don't feel that's the case due to no cohesive build-up, very little visual storytelling that is not really worth mentioning at this point in the story, and ill-fitting music. Moving on to the next game, Sonic Lost World also doesn't present its story well. We don't know anything about the Deadly Six or Zeddy. We don't know why they're villains or their backstories, how their abilities work, why the magic conch shells are weakness, anything of interest of sorts. They're just the bad guys that Sonic has to face. Also, you will forget this game's entire plot takes place on a different planetoid. What is the Lost X? Why is it called the Lost X? What makes it lost? I don't know. The game doesn't answer that, so I lost interest. Lost X is just a little planet without the sauce. The presentation in Lost World story, or the lack thereof, is extremely forgettable. Forces is in a similar spot because it tries to be about liberating the world from Eggman. However, not only the game doesn't feel like a long war against Eggman, as it tells us how he conquers the world in a few months, the places in the game don't give off the impression that things are bad under Eggman. Like, Green Hill's water has been replaced with sand, but that's it. Someone could interpret that Green Hill is near a desert landscape. Chemical Plant is covered in snow, but that can be the weather with no relation to Eggman. Even Metropolis, which is supposed to be Eggman's capital city or headquarters, doesn't present the idea that Eggman took over the city or even built it. It's just a futuristic city. Other than Sunset Heights, the imagery of war in this game is either very vague or not convincing enough for the story to tell the player that it takes place in the Eggman dystopia, so that the player can be motivated to take back the world. My point with all these games is that how they present their story is very important to get the necessary reactions for the player to care about the characters, the world, and states that are established in the game. Great presentation also gives a story in the game a strong identity. If not, the player will feel very detached from the story and will be very apathetic to it. Sonic Forces, for example, I don't feel like I finally ended a tiresome war and now longing for a much needed break in the upcoming peacetime era. I just feel like stop Eggman for the umpteenth time. If the story is presented right, it will make the player have an emotional connection to the story and what they do in the game. At the end of Sonic CD where Little Planet goes off and disappears, you don't think you save it, you know you save it. And the game rewards you by leaving flowers and saying, "You're too cool." You feel accomplished. With the examples I provided, great presentation makes the story in these games feel alive and immersive with visual storytelling in its art direction, a substantial amount of world building, and other details such as music that fits the tone. Let's move on to pacing. Now, in any story, what determines good pacing is dependent on someone's liking, but for me, I believe good pacing exists to whether or not there's still movement in the story no matter the tempo, or better yet, if progress is still being made in the story. Good pacing actually complements the presentation in the story. Let's look at the GOAT that is Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Sonic 2 is a game that started the tradition of zones having 2 acts. However, Metropolis Zone is a section with 3 acts. Now, people have rightfully complained for years about this because Metropolis is obviously not a fan favorite. However, it makes sense that it has 3 acts. It's the last full zone in the game. It's the successor to Scrap Brain Zone for Sonic 1, and it's the last zone located on West Side Island. Then we get to Sky Chase, which is essentially the Calm Before Storm level with Sonic and Tails on the tornado. And near the end of the level, you see Wing Fortress flying beside him, foreshadowing that it's the next level. You get the Wing Fortress and get to the end of it where Eggman escaping the Death Egg, which releases Sonic hitchhiking in to get to the final battle. People forget that Sonic 2 is the first game that technically did stage transitions. Sonic 2's pacing is very fast in the first half of the game because it's light on story, but once it starts to slow down and reaching Metropolis Zone, it highlights that the story is going to be at the forefront. That's why Sky Chase, Wing Fortress, and Death Egg are 1-act levels due to the pacing being at a natural slow pace to make the story and game feel grand as it reaches the climax. If these zones had 2 to 3 acts, it wouldn't have worked for the story as it would drag it in the game. Sonic 3 follows the precedent that Sonic 2 set, and when you see that Hidden Palace is 1 act, you know things are about to go down. Same thing applies to Sky Sanctuary Zone. That's how the 2D games handle pacing for storytelling. With the 3D games, pacing is more dependent on how plot details escalate or how the character goes either evolves or changes throughout the story without sacrificing any movement. XA2 once again is a prime example of this because you never feel like the pacing drags in that game. It's because that game can be split up into different chapters. First chapter is a setup, both figuratively and literally. The second chapter depicts the events that occur on Prison Island. Third chapter revolves around the reveal of the Eclipse Canyon. Fourth chapter is in the desert. Fifth chapter is the conflicts that arise on board the Ark, and the final chapter is about preventing Armageddon. You can analyze each session of this game and see how well paced it is, especially how each chapter flows in the next one due to the constant movement, no matter if the scenes are slow or fast paced. There are clear set goals from each character in each session of this game's story, and the audience get to see how those goals naturally evolve or change over the duration of the story within each chapter. Shadow being the prime example of that. To me, when pacing is bad, it's one of two things. If a story segment or level feels like filler or plot points are being repeated with no development. Now, if I deem a segment of a story as filler, that doesn't necessarily mean I think that segment on its own merit is objectively bad or not fun if referring to a level. It's more that I believe it doesn't progress the story. Just want to say that. Using Superstars as an example again, that game to me has filler. Let me explain. Remember what I said about Sonic 2 and how it utilizes having specific zones, having a specific number of acts to help the pacing and presentation of the story? Sonic Superstars is how you do it wrong. Superstars has 3 1-act zones that don't mean much to the story of the game, which they come off as filler. Sky Temple is the 3rd zone in the game, but it has 1 act. Nothing of much significance happens here. Same logic applies to Sand Sanctuary and Cyber Station Zone. It breaks the pace in the story in the game when you have levels that don't mean much to it. It makes me want to ask, what's the point? It hurts the flow and presentation of the story as well because what's the deal with the Cyber Station? It's between Golden Capital and Frozen Base, which are the penultimate levels of the game, and to give some credit, they are at least actual locations on the island. Cyber Station is just a video game level with no build-up or whatsoever that comes out of nowhere. The fact that it's 1 act makes it a pointless level, and takes the pacing and urgency away from the climax of Superstars. Not to mention, the character acts in specific zones drag out the game because they don't do much for the story, excluding Aunt Amy, which actually furthers to his character arc and the story itself. Speed Jungle, Golden Capital, and Frozen Base have 3 acts in total, and you have to play all 3 for no reason. Again, it hurts the pacing of the story and the flow of the gameplay since Aunt Sonic, Aunt Tails, and Aunt Knuckles don't do much for it. Unlike Sonic 2, Superstars' pacing makes the story feel unorganized. I think another example of not having good movement in the story is if the plot escalates to the pivotal point of the narrative very early and not much happens afterwards. Color is a good example of this. That game is about Sonic and Tails figuring out what Eggman is doing in the Wisps. Planet Wisp is enslaved by Eggman, and this is the world where Sonic makes this declaration.
No copyright law in the universe is going to stop me!
Yeah, that scene. But after this world, it just stops. The story of the game always takes a huge backseat after Planet Wisp. The stakes of saving the aliens stop escalating after this point. You get that one scene in Asteroid Coaster, but it's not as big of a revelation in comparison to the destruction of Planet Wisp. What I'm saying is, cover stories feel like it was on autopilot after this point. If anything, Planet Wisp should have been the penultimate world of Sonic Colors so that there could be natural progression leading up to saving Wisp there instead. Planet Wisp is treated as another location in the game, and that does a disservice to the message of the story. Let's move on to the big one, Sonic's story in Sonic 06. His story has no sense of movement because of the whole Elise gets kidnapped plot trope. Every time she gets kidnapped, barely anything new is done with the plot trope until she decides to surrender herself. The scenes where Silver tries to kill Sonic, which results in her getting kidnapped, are nearly identical. And mind you, in the latter scene, you just rescued her 20 seconds ago. If they cut it down to Elise getting kidnapped 3 times that actually further her agency and character arc in the story, it wouldn't be an issue. It's also worth noting that Sonic's story has filler and it's bad. You played through Wave Ocean twice, and the end result that Eggman gets away with Elise. Again, this is what I'm talking about when it comes to movement. The story repeats itself for no good reason and becomes really repetitive. The story is stuck in one freaking place. Pacing or natural movement is really important so the player can stay engaged in the story. If not, they will feel like the story is dragging its feet and will be bored, detached, or irritated. If done right, the player will be fully invested in the storytelling. Now we move on to our last category, character utilization. No matter how big or small a role a character has in the story, they still should feel like they are participating in the narrative. Heroes is a great example of this with the Chaotix. One of the main plot threads of Heroes is the mystery of who is actually pulling the strings. Team Sonic, Team Rose, and Team Dark are usually left confused on the mess that's going around them and their own personal issues in their narratives. Since this game is a huge mystery of who is a true mastermind, who solves it? The actual detectives. Metal Sonic doesn't take them seriously or needs to copy their data like the other teams, making Chaotix the underdogs, which the story does injustice in being the main team to figure out it was him. Shadow's story in 06 is actually the only story in that game where each of the playable characters actually matter to the story. Team Dark is at their best in this game with actual compelling character drama inflicted upon them by Mephiles as he tries to split them up. Mephiles tries to convince Shadow that the world will turn against him one day, but that doesn't matter as not only he will keep fighting like usual, he has 2 loyal teammates, or better yet, friends, that will stand by his side. If their story in Heroes is about 3 misfits forming an alliance to make ends meet, then their story in 06 is about them being fully utilized as an unbreakable team. Now with that being said, how can a character not be utilized properly? Let's look at the recent 3D mainline game Sonic Frontiers. Sage is a new fan favorite, and I like her, but how her arc was handled is one of the story's mishaps. Throughout the game, Sage yearns to express her love to her father after observing how Sonic interacts with his friends, which is the core theme of her character arc. The problem is that she and Eggman weren't utilizing the story to show off why she wants to love her father, and the same thing goes for Eggman, as we only get snippets through his memos, which is just optional stuff. There weren't any scenes of the two building a father-daughter relationship. Instead, you get scenes of Eggman praising Sage and Eggman demanding her nearly back to back. It's still sort of sad at the end because a child got blown up. Oh my gosh, that happens twice in the series. And they're both Robotniks? What the f? It's just not the best way to utilize Sage because the emotional weight or impact isn't as strong as it could have been. Sage has spent the rest of her time in the story being cryptic towards Sonic and just saying, what's the point? Going back to Forces, this is where everyone is just there. Majority of the veteran Sonic cast are afterthoughts in the story because they don't have defined roles in the Resistance. Knuckles is the commander, but that's it. When the final battle takes place, they're just NPCs on the battlefield, no different than the actual NPCs on the battlefield. And characters like the Chaotix were given the roles of recruiters of enlisting people into the army, like the Avatar for example. That would be a way to give purpose to these characters and make them feel involved. Same thing applies to the villains of this game because due to them not being utilized in the story, you forget they're supposed to be these threatening generals of Eggman's empire, and you only get to fight one of them. They're just fodder, especially towards the end where they're just clones. That's lame. Now let's go back to 06. Blaze is a kind of unused character in Silver's story. Anytime Mephiles is present and talking to Silver, she just stands there. The story doesn't let her give her own commentary point of view in these scenes, only Silver and Mephiles. It's weird because the story doesn't go in depth on her Blue Hedgehog comment. You can see that it loses Sonic Rush, but that's a different game with a quote unquote different Blaze. Don't get me wrong, this is Silver's story, but Blaze is from the future too. She should have more involvement to save it as well. I'm saying this because her sacrifice isn't as strong as it could have been. The story does a decent job to convey that Silver and Blaze are good friends, but the player spends most of the time separated from Blaze, so there's little to no emotional attachment when she quote-unquote dies. Granted, that could be me, and I believe Blaze got slightly more use than the character this game is named after. Sonic is not utilized correctly in the story because he's put on autopilot. Princess kidnapped, Sonic saves her, rinse and repeat. The story doesn't know what to do with him other than making him Mario. No offense, Mario, you're cool too. How the narrative underutilized Sonic where he comes off passive instead of assertive makes him come off boring. I believe Adventure 1 is the standard of how stories should use Sonic because he was very assertive in that story, going from fighting chaos, initiating a Chaos Emerald scavenger hunt which he loses to Eggman, hanging out and trying to rescue Amy, finding on the egg carrier, finding out about the past of the Echidnas and Chaos, and defeating Eggman. He may not be the central character of the overarching narrative, but Sonic was very active in the story. You never feel like he's just a plot device because the story in Sonic Adventure 1 never treated him as such. In 06, when Elise surrenders to Eggman, Sonic is literally taking out of the story for no reason, which leads to the aforementioned pacing issue of replaying Wave Ocean again with Tails, and then he's back in the story with no fanfare, like the narrative legitimately forgot about him. He's literally just a plot device in this game. You see what I'm talking about? He's such an afterthought in his own story and it's just really awkward. Let me be clear, I'm saying that Sonic comes off as a passive caricature of himself because that's the result of the plot not giving him anything to work with, unlike the good amount of material he's given in Sonic Adventure 1. In this game's story, he is just Elise's caretaker, and since she's usually kidnapped most of the time, he is stuck in that role the plot designated to him, and he's not given any opportunity to act outside of that. Again, the plot took him out of the story to add undeserved tension and stakes to Elise being kidnapped the 5th time to drag the story out. Unlike SA1 where the plot moves forward as a result of Sonic's actions, in 06 he can only act when the plot needs him to move it along. And that's a disservice to his character. To wrap things up, how you use your characters is very important in your story. If no attention is given to them in the story, they would come off to the player as wasted or insignificant characters to fill out the roster, or if they're rather used oddly, they would come off as, well, odd or not themselves. To the point that the players can make the argument that the character can be replaced by someone else, or just ask what's the point of that character being there. If the narrative fully understands how to use them, the characters will present themselves to the player and the audience as meaningful and purposeful additions to the plot that truly needs them. So that's the criteria of what I believe makes a good Sonic story. Great presentation from the game when it comes to art direction, visuals of levels, and music to enhance the message and theme of the story. Consistent movement that helps the story naturally develop over the course of the game so it can stay engaging. Finally, using characters to their utmost potential so that the story doesn't feel like it's wasting its cast members. That was a lot. Before I wrap this video, I don't mean to offend anyone who likes any of the stories or games that I gave my critical feedback on. This video is just an excuse for me to express my passion for the storytelling in Sonic, both games that I'm not fond of and games that I am. Tell me what you guys think of this fan criteria of mine, or what are your favorite Sonic stories. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. I'm wondering what Sonic's favorite story is. People forget that he's a bookworm. He should start a book club. Oh no, he shouldn't. You know how toxic those can get?